The television studio lights burned bright as the interviewer leaned forward. Anderson Cooper's face showed the question before he even spoke it. Prince Harry sat across from him, hands folded, jaw tight. The memoir on the table between them carried a single word on its cover: spare. "You called her dangerous," Cooper said. His voice was steady, direct. "Your stepmother. The Queen Consort. Why?" The silence that followed lasted only seconds. But in those seconds, millions watching around the world held their breath. Harry's blue eyes flickered. Not with anger, not with regret, with something deeper. Something that had lived inside him for decades. Of the need for her to rehabilitate her. Image. The words came out measured, practiced. But beneath them was a story that stretched back 20 years. A story of two young princes who had lost their mother. A story of a woman the world had called the villain. And a story of what happens when survival in the public eye becomes more important than truth. Before we go further, if you want to hear the rest of this story and see more emotional, true stories like this, please hit that subscribe button. It means the world to us. The year was 2005. Harry was 20 years old. His brother William was 23. Their father, Prince Charles, was about to marry Camilla Parker Bowles, the same woman who had been in their parents' marriage like a shadow, the same woman their mother, Diana, had once called the third person in the relationship. Harry and William sat their father down. The conversation was private, tense, filled with the weight of everything unsaid for years. "We don't think it's necessary," they told him. Their voices were careful, respectful, but firm. "We don't think you need to marry her. Just be together, Pa." Charles didn't answer right away, but Camilla did. What happened next would set the tone for everything that followed. Shortly after those private conversations, stories began appearing in newspapers. Stories about William. Stories with details so specific, so precise. They could only have come from someone who was in the room. William hadn't leaked them. Harry knew that, which left only one other possibility. The game had begun. It's hard to understand what it means to live inside a royal family unless you've been there. Every headline matters. Every photograph is calculated. Every story planted or killed based on who needs good press that week. The family operates on hierarchy, on order, on the unspoken rule that some people matter more than others. And as Camilla was climbing that ladder, she had been cast as the villain for years. The woman who had destroyed a fairy tale marriage. The one who had come between a prince and his princess. The British tabloids had torn her apart. Her image was mud, but she needed that image repaired. If she was going to be queen consort one day, she needed the public on her side. She needed positive headlines, friendly coverage, and she needed it fast. So a deal was made. Harry didn't say it directly in that first interview, but the implication was there. Camilla had connections with the British press. The British press wanted royal stories. And there was an open willingness on both sides to trade information. Good press for Camilla. Juicy stories for the tabloids. It was a transaction, clean, simple, effective. But someone had to pay the price. There were going to be people or bodies left in the street, Harry said. His voice was quiet now, almost sad. Because of that, he paused. The camera stayed on his face, and I was one of them.
Oh.
The revelation hung in the air like smoke. For years, Harry had watched as stories about him appeared in papers. Stories about his drug use, his wild behavior, his struggles. Stories that came from somewhere inside the palace walls. Stories that were strategically timed to make someone else look better by comparison. He had been sacrificed. Not with a knife, not with violence, but with words, with headlines, with carefully placed leaks that painted him as the troubled one. While Camilla's image slowly transformed from villain to sympathetic stepmother, it was a PR campaign, and Harry was the collateral damage. Cooper asked another question, but Harry's mind was somewhere else now. Back in those years when he was young and angry and confused, when his mother's face stared at him from old photographs, when the woman who had helped destroy his family now sat at Sunday dinners, smiling, accepted, while he bit his tongue. He had tried to be okay with it. He really had, asterisk. Harry remembered the day they were told. Not asked. Told their father was going through with it. The wedding would happen whether they approved or not. He looked at William. William looked back. There was something in his brother's eyes that Harry recognized. Resignation. The kind that comes when you've fought as hard as you can and lost anyway. "We support you," they said together. The words tasted hollow. "We endorse Camilla. Just please don't marry her. Just be together, Pa." Charles said nothing. The decision was already made. Years later, Harry would write about that moment in his memoir, about how they had recognized that their father was finally going to be with the woman he loved, the woman he'd always loved. There was truth in that. Charles and Camilla's relationship went back decades. Long before Diana, long before the fairy tale wedding that the world had celebrated, but truth doesn't erase pain. Diana had known about Camilla from the beginning. She had called her the Rottweiler, had spoken about her in that famous BBC interview in 1995, her eyes heavy with sadness. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. The whole world had heard those words, had seen Diana's face, had watched as the perfect royal marriage crumbled into something ugly and public and devastating. And now that same woman was going to become their stepmother. The wedding took place in April 2005. Harry was there. William was there. They smiled for the cameras, shook hands, wished everyone well. The photographs from that day showed 2 young men in suits, standing beside their father and his new wife, their faces pleasant and neutral. No one looking at those pictures could have guessed what was happening beneath the surface. But Harry remembers. He remembers the feeling in his chest, the weight of it. He had tried to be happy for his father. Really tried, because he could see it. Charles was genuinely happy with Camilla. After all those years of hiding and secrets and public shame, they were finally together openly. Maybe that should have been enough. Maybe Harry should have let it go. But then the story started. It began subtly. A positive piece about Camilla here. A flattering photograph there. Stories about her charity work. Her sense of humor. Her dedication to Charles. The narrative was shifting. The villain was becoming the victim. The homewrecker was becoming the faithful companion who had waited decades for love. And every time Camilla's image improved, someone else's image took a hit. William was the first to notice it clearly. It was 2019. He called Harry, his voice tight with anger. Pa and Camilla's people had planted a story about him and Kate and the kids. Harry would later write. William was seething, done with staying quiet. "Give Pa and Camilla an inch," William had said. "They take a mile." Understood what his brother meant. It was the pattern they'd both been watching for years. Camilla needed good press, so the palace spin doctors would feed stories to the tabloids. Some true, some exaggerated, some completely false. It didn't matter as long as it served the goal. But those stories had to come from somewhere. And often, they came at the expense of other family members. Harry thought back to 2002. He had been 17, struggling, acting out the way teenagers do when they're drowning in grief and confusion. He had experimented with drugs, cannabis, nothing more, but it had been enough. And then suddenly the story was everywhere. Front page news. Prince Harry, the troubled teen, sent to rehab by his concerned father. Charles, the caring dad, stepping in to help his wayward son. It was a good story. The public ate it up. Charles looked like a responsible parent, sympathetic, hands-on. His reputation benefited, but Harry's reputation was shredded. Later, much later, Harry would come to believe that the leak had come from inside, from Charles and Camilla's spin doctor, that he had been thrown under the bus deliberately. Used as a pawn in a larger PR game, he decided to throw me right under the bus. He would write in spare. It was strategic, calculated, and it worked. Sitting in his California home years later, Harry thought about all of this. About the small betrayals that had accumulated over time. About how he had tried to convince himself it wasn't personal, that it was just the way the institution worked. everyone using everyone else to survive the relentless scrutiny of the press. But it was personal. Because it was his life, his reputation, his pain being used as currency. The television interviews about his memoir had been hard. Exposing these truths to millions of people, knowing his family would be watching, knowing they would be angry, hurt, defensive. But Harry felt he had no choice. Anymore, I had complex feelings about gaining a step-parent who I thought had recently sacrificed me on her personal PR altar, he had written. Those words weren't dramatic. They were literal. And the worst part? Harry knew that Camilla hadn't done it out of malice. She hadn't woken up thinking about how to hurt him. She had simply been trying to survive, to rehabilitate an image that had been destroyed by decades of public hatred. But her survival had required his sacrifice. The phrase stuck with people. Bodies left in the street. It sounded dramatic. Violent, even. But Harry had meant it literally. In a family built on hierarchy, someone always has to lose. The monarchy isn't a democracy. It's a pyramid, and at the top sits the heir. Everyone else arranges themselves in order of importance below that. When someone climbs up, someone else gets pushed down. Camilla was climbing, and she was taking no prisoners. Anderson Cooper had pressed him on it during the 60 Minutes interview. How was she dangerous? He asked. The question hung between them. Harry's answer came carefully, thoughtfully. The connections that she was forging within the British press, there was open willingness on both sides to trade information. It was a transaction, a bargain. The press got exclusive stories, inside details, royal gossip. And in return, Camilla got favorable coverage, positive headlines. A slow but steady rehabilitation of her public image. The system had always worked this way. Royal correspondents and palace officials had relationships that went back decades. Information flowed in both directions. A palace aide would slip a journalist a story. The journalist would write it favorably. Everyone got what they needed. But under Camilla, the system became we need. Stories about Harry's drug use. Stories about his partying. Stories about his struggles with mental health. Each one carefully timed. Each one serving a purpose. While Harry was painted as troubled and reckless, Camilla appeared stable and supportive. The perfect stepmother, trying to help her wayward stepson. It was brilliant. PR, and it was destroying Harry's life. He thought about his mother often during those years. Diana had understood the power of the press better than anyone. She had used it herself, posed for photographs that told stories, given interviews that shaped narratives. She had known that, in the royal family, public perception was everything. But she had also been destroyed by it. Chased by photographers, hounded by tabloids, her every move scrutinized and criticized and turned into headlines. And now Harry was watching the same machine turn on him. Only this time, it was being fed by his own family. William felt it too. That's why he had called. Harry that day in 2019, angry, frustrated, tired of being collateral, damage in someone else's PR campaign. Give Pa and Camilla an inch, they take a mile. The brothers had argued about many things over the years, but on this, they had agreed. Camilla's need for positive press was insatiable, and it was coming at their expense. Harry remembered a specific moment, a conversation with Camilla. They had been talking about something casual, nothing important, but then she had made a suggestion. Offhand, almost joking. You could become the Governor-General of Bermuda, she said. Harry had stared at her. Bermuda, a tiny island territory. Far from London, far from the center of royal life, far from anything that mattered. The message was clear. You're in the way. You need to go somewhere else. He had laughed it off at the time, made some joke, but inside, something hardened. This was his family. These were the people who were supposed to protect him, and instead, they were actively trying to sideline him. Years later, when Harry moved to California with Meghan, people would call him selfish, a traitor, someone who had abandoned his duty. But Harry knew the truth. He had been pushed out long before he left. The institution had made its choice. Camilla's rehabilitation was more important than Harry's well-being. It wasn't personal. That's what Harry had to keep telling himself. Camilla wasn't evil. She wasn't sitting in a dark room plotting his downfall. She was simply a woman who had been demonized by the press for decades and was desperate to change that narrative. But desperation makes people dangerous. Maybe she'd be less dangerous if she was happy. Harry had written in his memoir. There was sadness in that line. A kind of hope that if Camilla just got what she wanted, maybe the attacks would stop. Maybe she would leave him alone, but it didn't work that way. Because in the royal family, there's always another threat. Always another person whose popularity might overshadow yours. Always another headline to worry about. Camilla had climbed from mistress to wife to queen consort. Each step had required careful management, strategic PR, favorable coverage. And each step had required someone else to take the fall. Harry had been the easiest target. The spare. The one who mattered less. The one whose reputation could be sacrificed without threatening the stability of the monarchy. William was the heir. He couldn't be touched. Not really. The institution needed him protected, polished, perfect. But Harry was expendable. He thought about all of this as he sat for the interviews promoting his book. People would accuse him of being bitter, of attacking his family for money, of airing private grievances for public consumption, but Harry didn't see it that way. He saw it as telling the truth. Finally, after decades of silence, the truth was that Camilla had been dangerous. Not because she was malicious, but because she was desperate, and desperate people will do whatever it takes to survive, even if it means throwing their stepson under the bus, even if it means trading his privacy for positive headlines, even if it means sacrificing his reputation on the altar of her public image. Harry had paid the price for Camilla's transformation, and he wanted the world to know it. The phrase appeared on page after page of the memoir. My personal PR altar sacrificed me. The language was deliberate, religious. It painted a picture of something sacred. It's being destroyed for a greater purpose. In this case, the sacred thing was Harry's privacy, his dignity, his right to make mistakes without having them broadcast to the world for someone else's benefit. And the greater purpose was Camilla's image. Harry tried to explain it during the interviews. Tried to make people understand how the system worked. If you are led to believe as a member of the family that being on the front page, having positive headlines, positive stories written about you, is going to improve your reputation or increase the chances of you being accepted as monarch by the British public, then that's what you're going to do. It was simple logic. It's brutal, but effective. The British public had hated Camilla for years. Polls showed it. Surveys confirmed it. She was the woman who had destroyed Diana, the villain in the greatest royal love story of the century. Changing that perception required a massive, sustained PR campaign. And campaigns require resources. In this case, the resource was information about other family members. Harry had been the lowest. Hanging fruit, young rebellious, grieving his mother in ways that were messy and public and easy to exploit. Every mistake he made became a headline. Every moment of weakness became a story. And with each story, two things happened. Harry's reputation suffered, and Camilla's improved by comparison. Look at how difficult her stepson is. Look at how patient she is with him. Look at how she supports Charles through this challenging time. She's not the villain. She's the victim of unfair press. She deserves sympathy, understanding, respect. The narrative shifted slowly, year by year, story by story, until one day, Harry looked up and realized that Camilla had somehow become more popular than he was. She had won, but the cost had been paid in his blood. There were specific moments that stood out in Harry's memory. Small things that seemed insignificant at the time, but accumulated into something heavier, like when he moved out of Clarence's house. He had lived there from aged 19 to 28, nearly a decade. That room had been his home during some of the hardest years of his life. The years after his mother's death, the years of military training, The years of trying to figure out who he was beyond being the spare, and then he left. And Camilla turned his bedroom into her dressing room. I tried not to care, Harry would write later, but especially the first time I saw it, I cared. It was such a small thing. A room. Just a room. But it felt symbolic. His space. His memories. His history. All of it erased and repurposed for Camilla's clothes. He was being written out of the story. One small piece at a time. Then there was the moment with Meghan. The first time Harry brought her to meet Charles and Camilla. They were at Clarence's house. Everything was polite, pleasant, but there was tension. Beneath the surface, protocol dictated that Meghan should curtsy to Camilla. She was the wife of the Prince of Wales, a senior royal. It was tradition, expected, but Harry had told Meghan she didn't need to. I didn't think it appropriate, he would later explain. It was a small act of rebellion, a tiny way of saying, you may be my father's wife, but you're not my mother. You don't automatically get that respect. Meghan had been confused. You sure? She had asked. Harry was sure. These small moments added up. They revealed something deeper. A resentment that Harry had been carrying for years. A feeling that Camilla had taken things from him that she had no right to take. His privacy, his reputation, his space. His mother's place in the family, and through it all, Camilla kept climbing. Kept improving her image, kept trading information for positive press. Harry watched it happen with a mix of admiration and disgust. It was impressive in a way. The sheer determination it took to transform from the most hated woman in Britain to queen consort. The strategic thinking, the patience, the willingness to do whatever it took. But it was also sickening, because Harry knew what it had cost. Not just him, but others too. William had been used. Kate had been used. Even the children. Stories about them would appear in papers at convenient times. Always when Camilla needed a boost. Always when the narrative needed redirecting. Give Pa and Camilla an inch. They take a mile, William had said. And he was right. The institution protected Camilla now. She was queen consort. She was essential to the monarchy's future. Her image had to be maintained, protected, enhanced, which meant anyone who threatened, image had to be dealt with. Harry had become one of those threats, not intentionally, not at first. But as he grew older and started questioning things, started speaking out about mental health and the toxicity of the press, he became dangerous to the carefully constructed narrative, so the stories about him got worse. More frequent, more damaging, troubled Harry, difficult Harry, Harry who can't follow the rules, Harry who's angry and resentful and causing problems for everyone. Meanwhile, Camilla glided through it all, serene, supportive, the perfect royal wife, the woman who had waited decades for love and finally got her fairy tale ending. It was a masterclass in PR, and Harry had been the collateral damage. Sitting across from Anderson Cooper, explaining all of this to millions of people, Harry felt a strange sense of relief. Finally, he was telling the truth. Finally, people would understand what had really happened, but he also felt sad, because none of this should have been necessary. None of these sacrifices should have been made. If Camilla had just been honest from the beginning, if the family had protected each other instead of using each other, if the institution had valued people over image, but that's not how it worked. And Harry knew it never would. The transformation had been remarkable. If you looked at polls from the early 2000s and compared them to polls from 2022, it was like looking at two different people. In 2005, when Charles and Camilla married, a majority of Britons opposed her ever becoming queen. The memories of Diana were too fresh. The pain too raw. Camilla was the other woman, the homewrecker, the villain who had destroyed the fairy tale by 2022. When Queen Elizabeth died and Charles became king, most Britons supported Camilla as queen consort. She was seen as a steady presence, a devoted wife, someone who had been unfairly demonized by the press. How had that happened? Harry knew exactly how. He had watched it happen in real time. step by step, story by story, sacrifice by sacrifice. The first step had been visibility. Camilla started appearing at more royal events, standing beside Charles, smiling for cameras, doing charity work, meeting with veterans and visiting hospitals and attending state dinners. She was present, consistently, unavoidably. The second step had been humanization. Stories began appearing about her sense of humor, her love of gardening, her relationship with her grandchildren. She wasn't a villain. She was a grandmother, a normal person who happened to love a prince. The third step had been victimization. Stories emerged about how difficult it had been for her, how the press had hounded her for decades, how she had been portrayed unfairly. She wasn't the villain. She was the victim. And the fourth step, the crucial one, was comparison. Stories about other family members, their mistakes, their scandals, their difficulties, always timed to make Camilla look better by comparison. Look at Harry's drug use. Look at Andrew's scandals. Look at the dysfunction. And there's Camilla. Steady, stable. A rock for Charles. It had worked brilliantly. But Harry also understood something else. Something he tried to explain during the interviews. Wasn't sure people fully grasped. Camilla hadn't wanted to be the villain. She had never set out to destroy Diana's marriage or hurt anyone. She had simply been in love with Charles. Had been in love with him for decades. Through her own marriage, through his marriage, through everything, and when they finally had a chance to be together openly, she found herself as the most hated woman in Britain. That must have been terrifying. Knowing that millions of people despised you, that your name was synonymous with betrayal, that you would never be accepted, never be loved, never be seen as anything other than the villain in someone else's story. So she had fought back, using the only weapons available to her: the press, public relations, strategic leaks, and carefully placed stories. I have a huge amount of compassion for her, Harry had told Michael Strahan during his Good Morning America interview. Being the third person in my parents' marriage, and he meant it. He did have compassion. He understood why she had done what she did, but understanding didn't erase the damage. Compassion didn't undo the sacrifices he had been forced to make. The late Queen Elizabeth had seen something in Camilla. In February 2022, on the eve of her Platinum Jubilee, Elizabeth had made a public statement. She wanted Camilla to be queen consort when Charles became king. It was an endorsement, a blessing, a sign that Camilla had been accepted at the highest level. Harry had read that statement with mixed feelings. Part of him was happy for his father. Charles had spent his whole life waiting to be king, and now, when that day came, he would have the woman he loved beside him. That was something. But part of Harry was also bitter, because that endorsement had come at a cost. His cost? William's cost. The cost of everyone who had been used as stepping stones in Camilla's climb to respectability. When Spare was published in January 2023, the reaction was immediate and intense. Headlines screamed about Harry's accusations, his use of the word dangerous, his claims about Camilla leaking stories to the press. Royal watchers were shocked. The public was divided. Some supported Harry. Finally, someone was telling the truth about how the institution really worked. Others condemned him. How dare he attack his stepmother? How dare he air private family matters? But what surprised Harry most was Camilla's reaction. Or rather, her lack of reaction. According to friends close to her, Camilla had been hurt by Harry's words. Of course she had. No one wants to be called dangerous. No one wants their stepson to publicly accuse them of sacrificing him for their own benefit. But she didn't lash out, didn't issue statements, didn't fight back. She simply carried on. Attending events, fulfilling duties, standing beside Charles with that same steady smile. It was what she had always done. Absorb the criticism. Wait it out. Let the storm pass. And eventually, slowly, her image would recover again. The Marchioness of Lansdowne. One of Camilla's closest friends had described her reaction to the Times. It was not stamping of feet or gnashing of teeth. Camilla was hurt, but she didn't let it show, because showing vulnerability would undo years of careful image management. The steady, unflappable queen consort couldn't afford to be rattled by her stepson's memoir, so she stayed silent and let the institution defend her. King Charles was reportedly distraught and outraged, according to sources. Not because Harry had spoken about him, but because Harry had spoken about Camilla that told Harry everything he needed to know. After all these years, after everything, Charles would always choose Camilla over his sons. It wasn't a surprise. Not really. Harry had known it for decades. But seeing it confirmed so publicly still stung. The media analysis continued for weeks. Experts dissected every word of the memoir, every interview, every accusation. Some believed Harry completely. Others thought he was exaggerating, being dramatic, using his family for profit. But one thing was clear. The conversation about Camilla had changed. Again, she was no longer just the reformed villain. She was now also the victim of her stepson's attacks. A woman who had worked hard to rehabilitate her image only to have it torn down by family drama, in a way. Harry's memoir had given Camilla another opportunity to be sympathetic, to be the gracious royal who rose above petty accusations, to prove that she really had changed. The irony wasn't lost on Harry. In the months following the memoir's release, Harry had time to reflect, to think about what he had done, what it meant, what it cost. Spare had become the fastest-selling nonfiction book of all time. Millions of copies sold within days. Everyone wanted to know the secrets, the scandals, the truth behind the carefully managed royal facade. But for Harry, it wasn't about sales numbers or records. It was about finally being able to speak, to tell his version of events, to explain why he had left, why he had chosen a different path, and central to that explanation was Camilla. The woman who had been dangerous. The woman who had needed to rehabilitate her image so desperately that she had been willing to sacrifice her stepsons to do it. Looking back now, Harry could see the whole arc. From that first private conversation in 2005, when he and William had asked their father not to marry her, to the published memoir in 2023, nearly 2 decades of watching Camilla climb, of being used as collateral, of having his pain turned into someone else's gain. He thought about his mother often, wondered what she would think of all this. Diana had understood the game better than anyone, had played it herself, but she had also been destroyed by it. Would she have wanted Harry to speak out? To expose the machinery? To tell people how the institution really worked? Or would she have wanted him to stay silent? To protect the family? To keep the secrets? Harry would never know. But he suspected she would have understood why he did it. Because Diana had tried to tell her truth too. In that BBC interview, in those conversations with friends, she had wanted people to know what really happened in that marriage, and she had been punished for it. The family had never forgiven her for speaking out, for breaking the unspoken rule. Never complain. Never explain. Suffer in silence. Protect the institution at all costs. Harry had broken that rule too, and he knew there would be consequences. His relationship with William was fractured. They barely spoke now. The brother who had once been his closest friend was now distant, cold, angry at the public airing of private matters. His relationship with Charles was strained. The king was caught between his wife and his son, and he had chosen his wife. That much was clear. Even his extended family had turned away. The cousins who used to text, the relatives who used to call, everyone was loyal to the institution first, to him second, or not at all. But Harry had Meghan, and his children, and a life in California that was his own, away from the palace walls, away from the hierarchy and the plotting and the constant trading of information for positive headlines. He had paid a price for his truth. But he had also gained something. Freedom. The question that lingered was whether it had been worth it, whether exposing Camilla's campaign had accomplished anything beyond satisfying his own need to be heard. Public opinion remained divided. Some people saw Camilla differently now. understood that her transformation had come at a cost, that real people had been hurt in the process. Others dismissed Harry's claims as the bitter complaints of a privileged man who didn't appreciate what he had, who had thrown away his royal life and now wanted sympathy for it. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Camilla had been dangerous, not in a violent way, not in an evil way, but dangerous in the way that desperate people are dangerous, willing to do whatever it takes to survive, to change their story, to become accepted, and Harry had been in the way. The spare, the one whose suffering could be used as a tool, whose mistakes could be leveraged for someone else's redemption. It was a cruel system, one that had existed long before Camilla and would exist long after. The monarchy had always operated this way, using people, trading them, sacrificing them for the greater good of the institution. Harry had just been the latest casualty, but he was also the first one to speak about it so publicly, so definitively, to name names and explain mechanisms and pull back the curtain on how it all worked. That was dangerous too. Not to Camilla, not to Charles, but to the entire system. Because if people understood how the game was played, they might stop playing along. They might stop believing the carefully constructed narratives. They might start questioning who else had been sacrificed, who else had been used. The institution couldn't allow that. So they had closed ranks, protected Camilla, painted Harry as the problem, the disgruntled ex-royal, the one who couldn't handle the pressure. It was the same playbook they had always used, and it still worked. But something had shifted. Something small, but significant. People were asking questions now. About the relationship between the palace and the press. About who benefits from certain stories. About what the word sources really means when it appears in royal coverage. Harry had planted seeds of doubt. Whether they would grow into something larger remained to be seen. In his California home, far from London, Harry thought about all of this. About the memoir that had changed everything and nothing. About the stepmother who had been dangerous and desperate and, in her own way, survivor. He thought about the word he had used to describe her, dangerous. It had caused so much controversy, so many headlines, so much analysis. But looking back now, Harry wondered if he had been entirely right. Yes, Camilla had been dangerous to him. Her need for positive press had cost him his reputation, his privacy, his relationship with his family, but she had also been dangerous to herself, because in the process of rehabilitating her image, she had revealed something important about the monarchy, about how it uses people, how it trades them, how it survives by sacrificing its own, and now the world knew. Not everyone believed it. Not everyone cared. But the truth was out there. In his words, in his memoir, in the interviews that millions had watched, the truth about Camilla, about the institution, about the price people pay when they're born into or marry into a family that values image over humanity. Harry had paid that price, and now everyone knew why. The story didn't have a neat ending, no resolution, no reconciliation, just the cold reality that some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. But Harry was at peace with it, because for the first time in his life, he had told his truth, not the palace's version, not the press's interpretation, his truth. And that truth included a woman who had once been a villain, then became a queen, but had always been dangerous. Not because of malice, but because of survival. In the end, that was the real lesson. That the monarchy, for all its pageantry and tradition, was simply a group of people fighting to survive, to stay relevant, to maintain power and position and public approval, and sometimes that fight required sacrifice, required someone to be thrown under the bus, required bodies to be left in the street. Harry had been one of those bodies. But unlike the others before him, he had gotten up, dusted himself off, and told the world exactly what had happened. Whether anyone would listen, whether anything would change, was beyond his control. But at least the truth was out there now, and that Harry decided was enough.